everyone, and welcome to this special event launching Baroness Shami Chakrabarti's important new book, Human Rights, the Case for the Defense, brought to you by the Policy Institute at King's College in partnership with the Dixon Poon School of Law. I'm Satvinder Jas. I'm a professor of law here at King's College, London, and I'm honored to be chairing this event this evening. Human rights, well, you might well ask, why human rights? Well, quite simply because it is the language for a society through which it makes its ultimate legal claims. So much so that talk of human rights in our culture has become the authoritative language of the law. And it's not difficult to see why that should be the case, because as Shami herself points out earlier on in her book, in the midst of the terrible inhumanity of the 20th century, one need only look at Stalin's Russia and Pol Pot's Cambodia. The one hopeful story that did emerge in international law was the idea of human rights. And by the time you get to the 1990s, you see the Columbia University law professor Louis Henkin write his book, The Age of Rights, in which he makes the point that ours is the age of rights, the idea of our time, the only political moral idea that has received universal acceptance. Now, that may well have been the case, except that, as Shami points out, all of that is very much now contested and under siege. That settlement, as she points out, that settlement on the rights to refuge, to health, to education, to living standards, to fair trials, to free speech, to be free from torture, slavery, and discrimination, that settlement is now under attack from opponents both on the left and on the right, and from populist and authoritarian movements worldwide. And as she also goes on to say, that the world is in turmoil, both with wars real and imagined. And as to where human rights should go in this context, where they are being increasingly threatened and challenged and met with disapproval. Added to that also is the fact, of course, that this is the first time since 1948, the UDHR, that countries not belonging to the Judeo-Christian tradition and the natural law traditions are among the world's most developed. And that will also have an impact on the way in which we do rights. And so that being the case, this is why Baroness Chakrabarti's new book is so vital, because she does confront these questions head on. And in this book, Human Rights, the Case for Defense, she provides a powerful and comprehensive case for the enduring importance of human rights protections. She draws on her distinguished career as a human rights lawyer, as an advocate. She outlines the historical struggles behind establishing human rights laws, the legal and moral principles they uphold, and she explains why they remain essential guardians of human dignity and justice. We will also, of course, hear from the distinguished, renowned human rights legal scholar, Professor Colm Okenade, who is the Professor of Human Rights Law at UCL, and we will have his perspective. And then there will be plenty of time for questions to Shami and to our panel here. And we look forward to chatting further over refreshments at the end of the session. We are also joined, as you'll have gathered, by the independent seller Daunt Books. If you could pick up your copy of Human Rights, the Case for the Defense, then that would be just absolutely superb. So let me then just end with what I thought to be the most, in many ways, a captivating statement by Shami, where she makes the point, to believe in human rights is to believe in human beings. If they and we are to survive, these rights must be owned and understood by everyone. And I suppose that is it, isn't it? That we've failed to own our rights as human rights. Please, with that, join me in welcoming Baroness Shami Chakrabarti to the stage.
Because this was designed for a taller person, I wonder what will happen. Will anything bad happen if I just do that?
No.
Is that a no? Don't do it, Shami. Do it. If I close this laptop, will there be a problem? Don't close it fully. Got it. It's not closed fully. I think what I might do, because this was designed for a taller person, is just stand slightly to the side of the lectern, if that's all right with you. It's a huge privilege to be here. And even the fact that I'm here this evening is a sort of exercise in welcoming migrants, because I studied at the LSE over the road. And yet I've always, it's true, but I've always had friends in this place. And I'm particularly grateful to the Policy Institute for, over the last 3 years, lending me some precious time of their wonderful PhD candidates. And so for the last 3 years, I've had amazing PhD candidates from King's in the Policy Institute who have supported my work. And last year, which was obviously an important moment for the development of this book, I had the pleasure of working with Mary Paz Arrieta Ventura, a Mexican-American PhD candidate here, who would have been here in conversation with us this evening, but her grandmother is unwell in Mexico. And so that's why she's not here. But I want to thank her for her contribution from being an early reader of this book that we're going to discuss this evening. To believe in human rights is to believe in human beings. It is to strive for everything we need to live with the possibility of flourishing in the world. It requires thoughtful empathy, an appreciation of our species as creatures of body and mind, of instinct, emotion, faith, logic, and reason. Individuals, but also social beings. Humans yearn for autonomy, but also belonging and respect. And these twin aspirations combine in the concept of dignity. And this recognizes that every human life matters, and that as far as possible, each of us should have agency in the way that we live. Human rights provide the poetry of both cries for freedom and pleas for protection. When the sacred and secular collide, each seeks this special higher ground, as do all competing interests in battles for liberty, equality, recognition, and resources at home and abroad. The world is in turmoil, ravaged by wars, real and imagined, proxy and phony. It is riven by oppression, inequality, and impending climate catastrophe. What many had come to rely on as the post-1945 settlement for securing greater justice, equality, and peace is now once more in flux. This is especially, if not uniquely so, in the Middle East and in Europe, where 2 world wars and then the Cold War once began. However, despite all sorts of progressive advancement, global population growth and technology and weapons proliferation bring an even greater interconnection that makes conflict anywhere perilous for people everywhere. As a currency of values, human rights are constantly called upon and yet still reviled. Invocation and attack may come from the same voices at different times. There are skeptics across the political spectrum. They question whether we need any higher laws, let alone fundamental rights, that the powerful, whether via might, privilege, or numbers, may neither bestow nor withdraw. They contest the basis of these principles, their content, limits, application, and enforcement. So is it possible to agree or at least establish the ground rules of reasonable disagreement so that human rights might survive and offer comfort and a compass for the future? I believe so, and this book is my contribution to that endeavour. It's very heartening to see extra chairs being brought in. Perhaps human rights aren't over just yet. There are competing theories about where human rights come from and why. Crucially, their development is completely intertwined with every complex episode in the history of human society. Attempts at uncoupling them are always a mistake. I write as a practical lawyer and campaigner of 30 years, not as a philosopher or historian. As a legislator, I make distinctions between laws and policies with which I disagree and those which seem clearly to violate dignity and human rights. So denying the vote or the adult minimum wage to 17-year-olds would fall in the first category. I disagree with that. But not to allow these guarantees to some of them on the basis of their sex or race would fall squarely into the second. There must be clarity, as without it, rights defenders are vulnerable to accusations of anti-democratic tendencies, or worse still, to charges of cherry-picking, even of modifying rights for our own political convenience. Human rights must be defended against complaints that they are individualistic and selfish rather than uniting, that they are ethnocentric and Western rather than universal. In a healthy political community, comfortable in its skin, and which debates the application of human rights in policy and lawmaking, judges need not become overly politicised. Nor need human rights invade rather than inform the business of elected governments that respect the rule of law. I consider various baskets of human rights and the positive and negative obligations on the state to actively deliver them or not to interfere. Civil and political liberties are essential to democratic life, as are social, economic and cultural rights to any quality of existence. Very few rights are described as absolute, but many are qualified or limited by protections for other people. What can they help us decide? What are their necessary limits? These questions are essential if rights are not to be distorted and devalued beyond recognition. How much can we proportionately interfere with qualified rights, say to privacy, speech, protest, or property? Where are the potential clashes between them? Equal treatment is essential to understanding and delivering human rights. As wars and pandemics, which bring death and hardship to some, and eye-watering windfalls to others so graphically demonstrate, human rights must to some extent seek to address the asymmetry of power and protection that lies at the heart of every major injustice. However, they can't by themselves resolve them. Rights evolved from the ethical, moral, and political frameworks of individuals and communities through struggle, and they now inform those frameworks in return. Their sparse but often lyrical drafting conceals tales of courtroom drama, political imprisonment, persecution, death, torture, and fighting the evil fiction of racial supremacy in the air, on land, and on the high seas. If you read the texts quietly, you can almost hear distant drums and liberation songs. Still, they also provide some binding obligations that must be enforceable in law against states and perhaps even against supranational public and private bodies in the near future. Ethics morals, politics, and law often overlap, but not so much as to undermine the importance of their distinctions. The late great legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin described these, I think, most clearly and compellingly. Ethics inform my personal choices, morals how I relate to others, and politics is the way that communities and societies make decisions, laws one important way of declaring and enforcing these choices. Just when I thought I was out, rages Al Pacino's Michael Corleone in the final part of the Godfather trilogy. They pull me back in. Remember? It's a great moment. Anyway, I can sympathise. As a human rights lawyer and campaigner of 30 years, I never imagined insurrection in the US Capitol, or that a great democracy like the United Kingdom might threaten to join rogue nations like Putin's Russia in walking away from the whole idea of fundamental rights and freedoms distilled by the generation that lived through the Holocaust and the Blitz. So the case for the defence is my response to the current debate about whether humanity in general and the UK in particular should tear up the post-war settlement as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specific instruments like the Refugee Convention, and regional ones like the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, which is incorporated into UK law by the Human Rights Act. Now that the dominant faction within the British Conservative Party has taken back control and got Brexit done, it can no longer blame the European Union for every social and economic problem that it has failed to address during 14 years in government. So it turns its rhetoric towards environmental campaigners, human rights lawyers, and desperate refugees in small boats instead. Mr. Sunak's flagship slogan for the imminent general election is "Stop the boats," which is an extraordinary slogan, isn't it? It's like the reverse Dunkirk spirit. Wasn't the national myth about saving people by way of small boats, not letting them drown? Anyway, but with the cruel stunt of attempted forced transportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda now on the statute book, his real target is courts, not boats. Whole rafts of both the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Act are now disapplied by the Rwanda Act. This overturned a finding of fact by our Supreme Court last autumn that Rwanda's asylum protections were inadequate and unsafe. UK courts have their usual jurisdiction drastically stripped back by post-truth legislation, which makes litigation in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg almost inevitable. And we might discuss in a moment with Professor Okanida the rather exciting developments in Belfast today. I have to say I almost shed a tear when I read that judgment today, to see the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission using the Good Friday Agreement not just for peace building and rights protection for the people of Northern Ireland, but for desperate people in boats. It's really quite a moving thing. But nonetheless, I do think that some kind of Strasbourg application is inevitable. And the moment that that claim is threatened or launched by refugee lawyers in the UK, the Prime Minister will blame what he has already branded a foreign rather than an international court for his failed policy. Then, as distraction from unconscionable inequality and failing public services, he will try and turn the general election into a referendum on pulling out of the Council of Europe, of which the Strasbourg Court is part, and which was founded by the Treaty of where? the Treaty of London 75 years ago. Success for him would mean stripping rights against degrading treatment and unlawful detention, for fair trials, personal privacy, and freedom of expression, not just from the boat people, but from every man, woman, and child in the UK. Sunak's task has been made easier by human rights skeptics from across the political spectrum who brand universal freedoms as either outmoded or late 20th century confection, or both. Some on the radical left treat them as a shield for unfettered markets, and on the right as a Trojan horse for undercover socialism. What they have in common is a fundamental nationalism that refuses to recognise inalienable rights that a political community neither gives nor may take away. They flow from human dignity, but also from the conditions that allow democracy to survive. And as I said, equal treatment is the key to both of these. As yet unrivalled post-war statecraft may have been responsible for drafting our international rights treaties, but in reality, their contents were born of centuries of struggle across the various continents of the world. They reflect values as well as law, and are as capable of inspiring as restraining our political instincts. It is unsurprising that they became expressly universal after 2 terrible world wars and in an age of atom bombs, aeroplanes, and cinema. I argue that these rights are even more essential now on our shrinking interconnected planet in the time of the internet, artificial intelligence, pandemics, drastic inequality, violent conflict, and climate emergency. Now, human rights don't provide magic solutions to all of these global challenges. They do, however, provide a vital framework for attempting to negotiate them without constant recourse to oppression and war. They need to be built upon, not razed to the ground. And that's impossible without wider ownership. To lack a general memory or understanding of what our most basic rights are is to walk even more vulnerably in the world. The nurse, the coder, and the actor should be able to argue about whether the judge or the politician got a particular decision just about right or completely wrong. That's what a truly free society looks like. To believe in human rights is to believe in human beings. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for that, which certainly for me was a most passionate, moving, awe-inspiring and thought-provoking talk, a fitting testament, in fact, to the book itself. We will now have a response from Professor Kaneda, and thereafter the floor will be thrown open to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Satvinder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by saying something about Shami in this book, respond a little bit to the argument she's put forward in the book, and then maybe throw out a few questions that she might be interested in responding or that might interest you in the audience. I should say by way of beginning that it's a great honor for me to be speaking here with Shami. Shami's been an extraordinary campaigner and advocate for human rights for 30 years, as she says herself, in different capacities, as a civil servant, as head of Liberty for a very, very long time, as a legislator in the House of Lords, and as Shadow Attorney General, and numerous other achievements. And she's been passionate, she's been eloquent, She's been focused. And she also writes with great prose and clarity. I was discussing this with Satvinder just before we started, that for those of us used to reading legal briefs and academic texts, it's a great pleasure to read something that's incredibly readable and eloquent and passionate, and talks about things like the poetry of rights. So it's a real relief, I have to say. So having said that, and having paid appropriate tribute, I think, to Shami, I was struck by Satvinder going back to the past and invoking Louis Henkin's famous phrase about this being the age of rights. And there was a sort of a wry chuckle went through a lot of the audience. And that was quite striking, because when I was a student in the 1990s, to talk about the age of rights just seemed like common sense. You know, it just was established wisdom, and we were sort of working through what that meant, rather than that being particularly controversial. There would have been no wry chuckle going through the audience then. Everyone would have nodded and sort of waited for something significant to be said. But it is true that the idea of human rights being a sort of agreed common ground, we can disagree about specifics, and people always disagreed quite sharply about the specifics in you know, the 70s, 80s, 90s. But you could disagree about the specifics, but there was a sense that there was a sort of agreed common language, that there was a common framework which people had agreed to use to think through some of these debates, to think through these fundamental issues. But now you have contestation around the very idea of human rights. Or, perhaps to put it more precisely, you have a sense that our existing vocabulary of human rights is outmoded, or as I described it in a lecture in Belfast last November, that it's obsolete. You have arguments from various different sides of the political spectrum, I have to say, that our existing language or existing framework of human rights, our architecture of rights, as Shami puts it very eloquently, is outmoded, a thing of the past, something best left behind back in Henkin's Age of Rights. It's an argument sometimes made by those on the left who say that our language of rights is inadequate to cope with Gaza, with climate change, with vast global inequalities, with technological change. Similar arguments are made on the right, who will say, well, we need to get rid of this obsolescent framework to deal with climate change, protests in our streets, changing societies. So you have this narrative of the obsolescence of the agreed language of rights being put forward from across the political spectrum. And yet, as Shami points out, people don't necessarily want to abandon, fully at least, the language of rights and liberties. So you have this strange phenomenon that she captures, that she put very well, of rights being simultaneously invoked and attacked by the same people, often in exactly the same speech. Okay? So in current passionate, divisive debates about protests in the streets of London around Gaza, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have people, for example, making the argument that freedom of protest rights are being stretched too far, and we must protect the rights of those communities who feel beleaguered by these protests. And then similarly, you have arguments being inverted in different ways. It's an interesting example of a common phenomenon of the language of rights both being attacked for being outmoded and yet invoked in support of a position. So there's almost an argument that rights are obsolete, that we need to let go of this language, and yet the language is being clung to because people are very few politicians, very few thinkers will come out and say, actually, it's time to ditch rights. As Jeremy Bentham said up in UCL, where I'm from, rights are nonsense on stilts. No politician will come out and say that. They might think it, but they won't come out and say it. Instead, they'll say, well, the old way of talking about rights is obsolete. are outmoded, are malformed. It's time that we either have a new language of rights, perhaps more restrictive, more controlled, more controlling, or perhaps we return to older understandings of rights, and with very often a tendency to invoke sort of nationalistic concepts of rights, as Shami criticizes, our particular understanding of rights. The "our" in that sentence is always very, very ambiguous. In a review of Shami's book in the Telegraph, Lord Sumpton, I should say, said, that Shami talks about socioeconomic rights, but this was never part of the British package of rights. Now, you could go back to the 18th century and raise interesting questions about this. The Scots are currently trying to incorporate the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights into Scottish law. So certainly the Scots seem to think it's part of the British vocabulary of human rights. So it's not quite sure who this "we" being invoked, who never liked socioeconomic rights, which are, of course, by the way, there in the Universal Declaration, which successive UK governments have endorsed with enthusiasm since 1948. So the "we" there is doing quite a lot of work, putting it mildly. But we are in this interesting, uncomfortable phase, this sort of clinging to the language of rights, even while it's been systematically called into account, described, analyzed in terms of obsolescence. This sort of constant drilling away at rights has produced this effect among defenders of rights of constantly being defensive, constantly being put on the back foot, constantly making legalistic arguments. Well, you can't do that because such and such a covenant or convention prohibits it, or you can't do that because of the Supreme Court judgment, or you can't do that because of constitutional essentials and so on. And those arguments are important. I wouldn't downplay them for a moment. As a law professor, I can't, even if I tried. However, I think it's also very important to make the positive case why the language of rights, the established language of rights, the universal language of rights carved out slowly across the 20th century, why that language remains relevant and remains important. And I think the real triumph of Shami's book is to make a positive case for the importance of this framework, why it's valuable, why it remains relevant even in drastically changing political, economic, and social and global circumstances more generally. I'll conclude by very briefly, I think, just saying that in my view, one of the key elements of Shami's book is that it brings out how the language of rights as it's developed have been sort of carved out over time, political compromise, political negotiation, but also from learned experience. They are a sort of technology of decency, a sort of way of learning from the past about how we should try and treat each other. They're a response to complexity and a recognition that we live in complicated circumstances where you have different governments, different groups of people trying to have a common democratic destiny, something that its critics often ignored. The Prime Minister today, in response to the Belfast judgment, said his interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement is that it didn't extend to illegal migrants. We'll skip over the illegal migrants comment. I just want to focus on that, his interpretation. The Good Friday Agreement is an international treaty between the British and Irish governments to which all the political parties in Northern Ireland signed up to. And the Windsor Framework, which implements it in the context of Brexit, was agreed between Britain and the EU and featured in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019, which was coincidentally the same year that Rishi Sunak became a senior government minister. So Rishi Sunak's interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement is one interpretation among multiple actors. That's an illustration of the complexity that we live in. The fact that, rights has been worked out as a response to complexity, as a response to democracy, and a need to learn the lessons from the past about how groups have been viciously and violently excluded over the years and continue to be so. So it's a sort of, as I said, a learnt technology of decency. And Shami's book, I think, is tremendous because of how it highlights the continuing relevance of this conceptual language in current circumstances and all the challenges that face us at the moment. It's an argument against the obsolescence of rights. And I'll simply conclude by just throwing out to Shami and just anyone listening today is the sort of question about, for those of us who share with Shami the belief that the rights aren't obsolescent, that our language of rights isn't obsolete, how can the sort of positive case be made, building on what Shami has done, how their relevance and continuing dynamism and capacity to change and develop as we change and develop as societies be made more apparent, be highlighted to confront some of the skepticism that currently at times tends to overwhelm the more positive story about rights. So that's a question for Shami, but a question for all of you to contemplate as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I shall now invite Shami again to respond to those reflections. A new language of rights, perhaps one that is not so obsolete, perhaps one that is more prescriptive.
Well, look, thank you so much, Colin, for that. What a privilege to have a response like that from... And by the way, you know you're getting older, not just because the policemen look, and the prime ministers look younger, but the law professors do as well. No, thank you so much. I loved your... I love the technology of decency. When I was writing the chapter about tech and AI, which is chapter 5 of the book, I was thinking about code. Now, I, had a misspent youth as a law student. I'm not someone who can write code. I guess a lot of the younger people in this great hall now, regardless of their discipline, will have some literacy around code, as in computer code. I don't, but in doing some of my research for the book, I had to learn a lot about AI and what algorithms are, and actually algorithms are a lot like law in that they are a list of instructions, and they are, they're code. And we talk about legal code, and I say the other way, I love the way that you flipped it in your remarks and talked about the technology of decency. I love that, I will take that away. But on the how to make the case, I think you're so right that when we're on the back foot the whole time, when we're having to defend cases in courts on behalf of whoever it is, criminal defendants, refugees, whoever it is, you're often already dealing with a demonized minority. And because, for example, legal aid has been decimated in this country, you pretty much have to be destitute to get access to civil legal aid. So the narrative of human rights in the country, in the newspapers, in the media, in the political discourses, a narrative about demonized minorities. Now, of course, demonized minorities need human rights more than anyone, but we all need our human rights, and we rarely get the narrative about somebody who isn't in a boat, but someone who is, for example, a postmaster or a postmistress working as a pillar of their local community. But of course, the Horizon scandal is a case study not just in careful what you wish for, because you're going to need the rule of law and you're going to need rights and freedoms. You never thought you would, but you might. It's also, because of the wonderful ITV drama, a bit of a response to Colin's question about how can we do more to improve this conversation and this narrative before it's too late. Because Mr. Sunak and his chums want to make it all about illegal migration. By the way, these people are not illegal. Most of them are convention refugees, and those that aren't are asylum seekers. Most of them will turn out to be convention refugees. That's why he's defenestrating the UK courts, not foreign ones. But we need a narrative that is, you know, it is stories on EastEnders, it is TV drama, it is, we need to find these opportunities to tell stories about people like us, whoever us is, people who are a bit more like every man and woman in the UK. I guess that's part of what we have to do, and not just to treat these things as, you know, there's a scandal, there's an injustice, but actually articulate that story and what the response should be to that story in human rights terms as well, I think. It's an imperfect answer, but it's the beginning of an answer. It's the beginning of a conversation, I think, about how, if we're, and we need to know what our rights are. You know, I think I say it somewhere in the book, you know, people, whatever your discipline, whatever your job, you would think it odd if you didn't know a little bit about the rules of football. I mean, the offside rule for me evaporates every time it's explained to me, but, you know, I basically know you have 11 people on each side, and you have 90 minutes, and et cetera, and these are the positions. I might even be able to name some famous football players, because that's just to be a human in this community. I think it is astonishing that more people don't actually know what their basic rights and freedoms are. So if you know the ingredients in your granny's recipe, you know your favourite football players, you know the characters in your favourite soap opera, you ought to know just what your basic rights and freedoms are, so that you can have a more informed conversation, argument about their existence and their application with your colleagues, with your family members, and with the politicians who, if you're not careful, will take them away from you.
Thank you. Might I just kick off myself by saying that in terms of the language of rights, the great beauty, the great virtue of rights talk is that it offers a normative vocabulary that facilitates both the framing of the claim as well as the identification of the rights holder, so that in a rights-fixated culture, pretty much anyone and everyone can make claims of rights. You mentioned legal aid. I well recall that period myself, where in this country we had the highest per capita publicly funded litigation in the world, £1.2 billion per annum, because people thought it to be a right that we all had. So it's very much, as I suppose the philosopher Nietzsche said, that rights are a product of the will rather than naturally ordained. But I wonder if there are any other questions in relation to what we've just discussed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Shami.
Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I have something in common with you, because I also don't understand the offside rule. It's been explained to me many times, and I still don't understand it.
No, I get it for a moment, and then it evaporates, you know. But.
Well, let me take you back to 1948 and the UNDHR. It's been often claimed that the main author of the declaration was René Cassin, although much of the more recent scholarship challenges that view, particularly the memoirs of John Humphrey and the work of Brian Simpson. I would argue that the main authors were Panchung Chang and Charles Malik, who had been the doctoral student of Martin Heidegger. The claims made for René Cassin also have to be viewed in the light of what happened next, because René Cassin later became a member of the Conseil d'État in France. And in 1961, a large number of unarmed, peaceful Algerian demonstrators were killed in Paris, and their bodies were thrown into the Seine at the direction of an ex-Vichy police officer, Maurice Papon, who was never tried for this. What's important is that René Cassin never said anything about it. And later on, he actually he got the Nobel Prize, but he also defended the illegal settlements on the West Bank, and he also defended the Israeli occupation, which was in breach of the United Nations Charter. So perhaps you could just comment on that.
As to these wonderful, juicy, historical debates and spats about who was more or less responsible for anything good in history, I will defer to the historians, and these arguments will no doubt continue. And I guess people have their own cheerleaders and their own people. And if you say, oh, there's a rival narrative from Baron Humphreys, well, there would be, wouldn't there? Because he was involved as well. So, it's like when people tell me that they've seen a movie, there's this movie called Official Secrets, about the Catherine Gunn case. And when I was at Liberty, we took this case for Catherine Gunn, and a very tall, elegant actress called Indira Varma plays me. Right? So how accurate is that? Okay. And people ask me, was it really like that? And I'm like, oh yeah, those male lawyers did everything. There were no women involved, and everybody looked like a movie star. Well, of course not. But it doesn't really matter, is what I would ultimately say to you about. There are all sorts of examples in history of people, imperfect human beings, doing wonderful things together. And that post-war settlement is a classic example. I call it an unrivaled achievement in statecraft for the human race. And I have to say, it ultimately doesn't matter if it was created by imperfect human beings for an imperfect human race. Other people can be fascinated by it, but I don't really care whether this or that drafter or negotiator in that process later fell down on their own values. This is what imperfect human beings do. What I care about is that framework as a distillation of values that could be shared by East and Western blocs, by global North and South, with their differing histories, their different languages, religions, no religions, and that achievement in the post-war moment, I think, is wonderful, extraordinary, inspirational even today, and we need more moments like that. So if the individuals weren't perfect humans, never mind, I think is what I say to that. Don't feel the need to.
Hello, thank you, the three of you, for the talk. I wanted to discuss kind of human rights language, and you all mentioned some sort of skepticism from both the right and the left. And I think there is growing skepticism today, especially from people who are facing the most grave human rights violations. And when I say that, I want to specifically reference, the Palestinian people who are facing a plausible genocide as stated by the ICJ. And so at some point, I think that language starts to look like not a language anymore. It starts to look like pleading to a wall that doesn't listen. And even when they listen and they gave a judgment, there's still nothing. And so at some point, yes, I do agree that sometimes the skepticism is weaponized, but I think the skepticism comes from, it's indicating a rotten foundation in the framework, that something is clearly wrong, and that something is clearly not working for us. Right. And so I want to call back to another author, also coincidentally called Chakrabarti, who says something along the lines of, how do we renegotiate these values from the margins?
Okay.
And so, just to wrap up, my question then is, at what point do we concede maybe that the framework is rotten, or do we then go the other route, which is saying, no, the framework is good, but we need to enforce it, but if the enforcement never worked, then isn't it just unworkable from the beginning? Okay,
so thank you for that. Very powerful and important challenge. In relation to Gaza, I don't think there's anything rotten in the framework. What we're watching is a failure of enforcement and respect for human rights. And in the penultimate chapter of my book, which is called War and Peace, I look at the UN. And well, I look at the relationship between human rights and international humanitarian law, but you also have to look at the UN. And I think there's a design fault, there's an inbuilt design fault in the Security Council, which was the winners of World War II, frozen in time. The permanent members have the veto, and that is problematic because the permanent members are just as capable of being threats to security as the likely international police force, if you like, for rights protection or for peace building. That is a challenge. But we've also seen some responses to that, even from the UN itself, with more creativity and more activism, if you like, from the General Assembly. And I cite some example. I mean, the book was finished before October the 7th and everything that followed, but I still think that that chapter is relevant to this issue. I don't think the value, I don't think you could point to a value, to a human rights value that is rotten in the context of the response to what happened on October the 7th. You can say that the values are not being respected and not being put into action, and that great democracies are not doing enough and should do more. But I still say that the interim decision of the ICJ is a very important thing. It's necessary but not sufficient. But I also say that protesters are human rights defenders too. There aren't enough judges on the planet, and judges and lawyers don't command armies in the end, which is why these values have to inform our politics and our protest and our wider cultural discourse as well. But what I don't agree with is the idea that there's something wrong in the values. The values are precious. I believe the values are innate and universal. We're just not winning the war of implementation at the moment.
Shami, can I? You said at the end of your talk about if we believe in human rights, and then you just said about values are innate and universal. Is there a tension there in that there is something inherently political about coming up with a declaration, such as all the declarations that we have? And the language of rights is very much, can be used against people seeming to be taking something. And I wonder if we've lost something maybe by moving away from civil liberties or a different way of framing it, that we need to acknowledge it is a political document, akin to maybe a constitution, but we've almost given this idea it's come down as a tablet of stone.
Well, thank you, Hannah. It's the professors that sneak into this place that ask all the difficult questions, It's the danger of coming to a university. So there are various things. So one of the challenges with rights language is that, in fact, I got a letter from a member of the public the other day, not in response to the book, but in response to reading something about the book in the press. It was a very short letter, and I haven't written back yet. But let's say there's no email address, it's a postal address, I'll get to it. But the gentleman concerned says, rights, ? What about responsibilities? Surely you've only written half a book. I'm cogitating about how to respond to that letter. All advice will be welcome. Of course, if he had maybe had a look at the book, he would see that we do, I do attempt to discuss it because rights are responsibilities by reciprocity. And Tom Paine, the great English-American international revolutionary activist and philosopher, wrote about this a very long time ago. That yes, rights should come with responsibilities, but they do, because rights are not real if they are not enforced, and they're not just enforced by courts and politicians and so on, they are enforced. We have a duty, certainly an ethical and moral duty to respect and help deliver the rights of others, whether our friends, neighbours, children, colleagues, whatever, and also ordinary laws of the land like criminal law and family law and so on, are part of delivering human rights in the detail by the web of reciprocity and so on. Civil rights are all very well, but they only go so far. And I talk about that in the book. You know, civil liberties, I worked in that particular field for a long time. Yes, we want our free speech and our fair trials and our personal privacy, but we need to eat as well. We need health care. We've just come through the pandemic, which ought to be an almost World War II moment in terms of coming out of that and going, right, we're not just going to clap the nurses, we're going to give them a decent pay settlement so they're not going to food banks. So I think civil rights and, civil rights as in, the US Constitution, civil rights as in the ECHR are fine, but they're not the whole story. And they weren't the whole story, as we heard from Colm way back in 1948. And you know what? Jonathan Sumption can give me the accolade that I invented social and economic rights. In response to his piece, a friend texted me and said, "So you, Shami, invented social and economic rights. Well done." They sound like a great idea to me, but in the UK in the post-war period, those social and economic rights were partly delivered through the NHS and the welfare state. So you have a different delivery mechanism, perhaps, for your social, economic, and cultural rights, and they take investment. But just because they're being delivered mostly by doctors and less by lawyers doesn't make them any less important as human rights, because human beings need them to survive and to thrive in the world. I love, by the way, that these little stickers are not just the colours of my book. And that colour is taken from the UN symbol for human rights. It's also the colours of the NHS. We have a lot of conversations in this country at the moment in politics about patriotism. I'll give you patriotism. It's called NHS. And it even has the word national in it.
Anyway, thank you for a very informative talk and also for the observations by Colm on language. Just on your point about Sunak, I think he needs to look in the mirror. Tell Sunak to look in the mirror. Anyway, we have the rise of treaties, countries signing up to treaties about human rights, economic rights, and other rights. They seem to sort of tick the box on these treaties. I think they're between 6 and 9 international treaties, starting with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Are we in a period now when countries are no longer accountable? So there's a policy statement that we agree with these treaties, but the practice at home is very different. And what seems to be coming out of all of this is really a sort of very much a window dressing on human rights. And when you look at less than 50% of countries are liberal democracies, which is to say an independent judiciary, something giving free elections, and a Bill of Rights. We have less than 50%. How optimistic are you for the observation of human rights internationally? Because I really think there's been a great decline in human rights, certainly if you go back to 72 and that period. Thank you.
Thank you. How optimistic. Look, I didn't write this book because everything's rosy in the garden. I wrote this book for the opposite reason, because I think people need to be mobilised. And for people to be mobilised, they need to know what their rights are and where they came from, and know what they're up against. So I do share your concern, and of course what we're seeing with the rise of populism is not just an attack on human rights, but an attack on the rule of law. You can't have human rights if you don't even have the basic. You can't, you can't even have democracy without the rule of law. If you look at any post-conflict situation, you have to start with the basic rule of law to stop people raping and murdering each other and stealing from each other. Just have that basic order. And I think that when senior politicians, including prime ministers, denigrate the courts, that's very troubling. And that has been something that we've seen in the UK for the last period. Certainly since Brexit, but it started before that. And if you won't even accept the referee, I mean, I found myself at times being almost nostalgic for Margaret Thatcher, which is quite an extraordinary thing for me to say from where I'm coming from, because when she lost a case like the GCHQ case that says your spooks are going to have the right to join a trade union, she sucked it up. Because that's an elected politician saying, okay, but I'm still bound by the rule of law. And I don't expect a kid on a council estate to accept, the magistrate's, the Beek's decision if I don't accept the judgments of the higher courts. And I would include, like Tom Bingham, I would include the international rule of law in that. So we need to, before we even defend human rights, before we even say we're celebrating democracy, we need to get back to the rule of law, which, of course, the late, great Tom Bingham wrote about so brilliantly. And he included a human rights component in his vision of the rule of law. And, we have to start here, now, in our communities and with our government. And then we, need to hope that with some, we've got these elections happening all over the world this year. It's quite a year. And I just think we need to get respect for the rule of law and rights and freedoms embedded in that wider political narrative.
There are at least two more questions, but before going any further, Colm here wants to...
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the specific point directed towards me and just to sort of unify a couple of the comments that have been made, just sort of supplementing what you've heard from Shami. We're in an era where there's a demand for change. I saw an opinion poll out today in the US, 70% of voters want radical change. Okay? So do I. Most of those voters who want radical change in the US are voting for Donald Trump, which I'm not. But it's an interesting illustration about this sense of radical change sweeps across the political spectrum. Okay? We're also in an era of critical genealogy, as us academics like to call it, the tracing the dubious steps of those who gave us what we've ended up with. René Cassin, a classic example, And we're looking at the gaps, the questionable behavior of those who drafted it, the enforcement gaps, the fact that people aren't paying attention, the hypocrisies and so on. So need for change, genealogical critique, an indictment of hypocrisy, of non-enforcement, etc., etc., etc. All of that adds up to a very powerful critique of the status quo. And the irony is that human rights, once a radical, exciting new idea, in a way has become part of the status quo. Okay, going back to the age of rights. And people on the left in particular never like using the language human rights status quo because that's not left language. But it reflects the fact that human rights sort of had a huge impact. You had the age of rights, and now suddenly you're in this huge unsettlement. Having said that, a couple of things to note. First of all our laws, customs, and social practices were formulated by dubious people in dubious circumstances. Okay? I mean, we like the ban on murder. We like the ban on sexual assault. We like the ban on property theft and all these things, thought up originally by psychopaths with huge swords in the Middle Ages. I'm simplifying, apologies. But, but we maintain these in force. We recognize that laws can become outmoded and that everything needs to change, to adjust. But we also recognize in our daily practices as a society that there is a sort of an inheritance of wisdom, so to speak, ways of negotiating our collective lives together, both domestically and internationally, that are actually quite important, and that we should, and plenty of our existing practice needs and deserves to be changed and swept away, but an awful lot of our existing day-to-day practice is valuable and something to be treasured. And I think in our different ways, Shami and myself, many others would make the argument that our human rights architecture is exactly one of those existing practices that needs to be treasured. And the problem, the sort of indictment of hypocrisy, you know, the indictment of, look what's happening in Gaza and other places around the world. I find it quite interesting. I actually think what's happening there isn't a failure of the architecture. What's actually happening is greater accountability is being imposed than used to be the case. Because I was never entirely convinced there was this golden era of massive human rights compliance. When you ask people when exactly it was, they start saying something like between 1995 and 2001. And, you know, that's a very specific period. And the reality is that we've attempted to formulate these standards. They've grown and developed over time. We've new ones about disability rights in other areas. They've been important. They represent a sort of working out of collective experience of trying to do our best. And there is a sort of an accumulation of wisdom, how to divide out rights, liberties, and responsibilities, for example, represented in those frameworks. And I think there is, for the academics among you, slightly ironically perhaps, a sort of the type of argument Edmund Burke might make, again, non-traditional left language, about the value of keeping hold of things that help us decently live together and could help us to live together better in the future. And the rights language is part of that sort of decent vocabulary helping us live together that we've inherited and that we can continue to develop, but still remains something important to treasure. Thank
you. I was just struck, Colin, and I'm saying this with some trepidation in a room full of lawyers and academics, about the readability of Shami's book, which unfortunately I haven't read yet, but I will, and how that really relates to some of the problems about communicating rights. And you talked about the obsolescence of language. And Shami, you were talking about the Horizon scandal, and you know. So I remember you coming. I used to work at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. You came and talked to us about the vision when the Human Rights Act came in for a programme of civic education about rights that never really happened. And I guess my question is, you know, I agree with your premise that human rights need defending, but are lawyers the best people to do that? And how do we, you know, how do we make that happen? What needs to happen? How do we get people to see the Human Rights Act in the way that it was envisioned as something that underpins public, you know, good quality public services? And I do wonder whether the pandemic and, you know, when we get the outcome of the inquiry is an opportunity, because human rights should have been an important framework for guiding how that was responded to. And perhaps it's something that will speak to more people.
Okay, let's take the second question. Yeah, we'll take a second question as well. Yeah.
Sorry, can I start by saying well done? This is an account which really needs to happen right now. But I was surprised that I haven't heard more about what we should do about the points when rights conflict. We see it on the streets at the moment with the demonstrations about Gaza and Jewish people feeling threatened. Those are both forms of important human rights which both need to be protected. But we don't really have a mechanism of dealing with what happens when they're in conflict. Why haven't we been able to hear more about that during this evening?
Well, Shami does have a section on conflict of the rights. Yeah.
Well, there is a chapter in the book called "When Rights Clash." But what I would say about your specific example of protest, and somebody protesting what's happening in Gaza, and someone else feeling intimidated, concerned that they're being blamed or whatever it is. I think there are a number of different responses that need to be engaged. Now, if there are protests that are in the wrong place, that are targeting, I don't know, school children or people at prayer or whatever, I think that actually our police, and certainly the new commissioner, have actually been rather good at understanding the proportionate limits on protest. And I think they've also been quite good at not utilising some of the appalling legislation of recent years to shut down noisy protest, for example. I think they've been reasonably good. People who've been on the demonstrations can tell me if I'm wrong, but from what I've read about the number of arrests and about the way the police have handled it so far every Saturday, I think they've been doing a pretty good job. And there is a level of understanding about policing protests that is informed by human rights law. But I would also say that, as I've said earlier and I've said in the book, human rights are not just law. They are also ethical, moral values. And I think that, we can call upon each other, we can call upon protesters to bear in mind how other people may be feeling. And I have personally seen, I've had sight of some of the instructions that particular protest groups have circulated, not just in relation to the Gaza demonstrations, but in relation to environmental demonstrations in recent years, that again show, to my mind, quite a high level of sophisticated understanding and empathy about other people who may be, have their daily lives interrupted, or people who may feel concerned. So we need to do both. We need to make sure that those policing protests are encouraged to hold the ring. I don't think it's an answer to have the Prime Minister calling in police chiefs for summits and issuing edicts the whole time, because that politicises the police, as if he's going to tell them who to arrest. I don't think that's helpful. I think it's showboating from Mr. Stop the Boats. But I do think that they are doing a reasonably good job at holding the ring. But I also think that it's important that demonstrators in any movement themselves have that internal mechanism for not least as good advocacy and good campaigning. And that's an element of understanding proportionality, understanding the rights and freedoms of other people, and so on. And I think there is some sophistication out there. It's not going to be perfect. In any movement, it's not an army, it's a movement, it's an organic thing, and people will have different views and then movements split. But I feel reasonably heartened in general that there is a level of understanding. On the question about rights education and the EHRC, I basically agree with you, and I share the sadness that, the Human Rights Act, this wonderful, it's a constitutional compromise in an unwritten constitution, no strike down power, so there's a limit, but it's nonetheless an exquisite compromise for an unwritten constitution with parliamentary sovereignty. I think it's a tragedy of it's not so young anymore, it's obviously, it's a young adult now, the Human Rights Act. It's not an infant anymore. But I think one tragedy is that when it was passed in '98, the then government that gave us that act wanted to train the judges to make sure they didn't get carried away, but never really loved that infant enough to to share it with the people and say, look at what we're doing. We are a government that are empowering you, and sometimes that will get up our nose because you'll be suing us, but these are your rights, these are your precious rights. At least know what they are. I think that's a tragedy. And then, of course, 9/11 happened about a year after the Act came into force. So that was a very unfortunate thing in a way. I mean, it was good in a way that we had the Human Rights Act for that difficult period, but it meant that the public narrative was about litigation post 9/11. But it's not too late. It's not too late. So what we have to do is to, and as I say, if you compare and contrast the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and the way that it works creatively and the way that it reaches out to the community with perhaps, some of the work in the UK, it shows there is hope, there is an opportunity with the right thinking and the right commitment. It takes commitment, it takes resources, it takes political commitment, not just legal commitment, because you are right, lawyers, it's not that lawyers aren't important, and in the end, if you're up against it, you want to be in court if you want to be released from unlawful custody. But you're so right, we need other advocates too. And Colin and I were talking earlier about one of the great things about American scholarship at the moment, ironically, is that there's so much human rights scholarship that's coming not from law schools, but from history departments and other social science faculties, and we need a bit more of that, I think.
Could I just say something? Yes, I agree completely with everything Shami said. One point I would pick out about rights, just to build on what she's saying, is that the language of rights and human rights laws has developed and influenced civil liberties law and public order law and so on, is a gradual accumulative process which sometimes goes right, sometimes goes wrong. But the principal framework can be quite important. And one important thing about it is that it serves sometimes to make politicians and courts and police and others respond not just to the specific context of something happening, but also to see things in a slightly longer, more abstract, more general terms. To take the really excellent question about the London protests, okay? If you're Irish, the notion that offensive marches are something new is just shocking. I'm sorry, I'm not from Northern Ireland, but if you're from Northern Ireland, people in Northern Ireland have been looking at the media coverage around recent protests and going, look, offensive marches, as in marches that are deeply polarizing on both sides. In Northern Ireland, 250 years of this. There is lots of human rights law and practice, often developed by community groups working together. An awful lot of policing practice has been developed in that context. It's not the same situation, it's different context, all contexts are different, but experience built up and crystallized in the form of human rights law, policy, guidance, and practice, often it's ignored, but that experience, the crystallized experience, can be extremely useful and means we're not reinventing the wheel every time we see a new situation that gives rise to all these fundamentally difficult concepts in our complex democratic society. So there's a sort of an accumulation of crystallized wisdom there, which I do think is important in these issues.
Yes. Last question.
Oh, God. I find it really interesting that you brought up AI, and I haven't read the book, so I apologize if you answer this question. But with people like Murdoch and now Musk and Zuckerberg, looking in the rearview mirror, these men make and spend billions on hatred. And as the pace of the internet and AI increases almost exponentially, is it possible to keep up? Are governments even the main actors anymore in the undermining of human rights?
Well, So do you want to go, does anybody else want to go first, or should I jump in? So I talk about this a bit in chapter 5 of the book, which is called Modern Prometheus, which you will know is the subtitle to Mary Shelley's great book, Frankenstein. So to take your second question first, I think that human rights treaties are going to have to be made binding on corporations, because they are, as you alluded, they are the new imperium. Forget, the United Kingdom and the United States and this empire and that. They are the new imperium. They just sail under logos instead of flags. They can buy and sell not just politicians but whole countries, and they are great violators of human rights. And they have their Byzantine legal structures, so they're mining the resources in one country, selling their products in another country, and incorporate in other countries, and then they play all these legal jurisdictional games about, oh, you can't sue us here, you have to. And so I talk about that in the tech chapter, but also in the climate chapter. So we do need treaties that will be more made directly binding over some of these entities. And they are all, they are they're man-made creations themselves, corporations, just like AI. And they're man-made creations that are currently out of control and need to be brought under our human democratic and legal control. I think in relation to AI, some of it needs to be banned, just like some weapons are banned, and some of it needs to be regulated. And we need to work towards international treaties and international regulation of this stuff, just as we have done at times with pharmaceuticals and with weapons. And I think, but these new treaties that we need to work towards will be infused with our existing human rights norms and values, and there might need to be some new rights potentially added. And there's a great deal of scholarship in this area at the moment, including in our main universities here, a lot of good stuff coming out of MIT and other places in the US, for obvious reasons, about maybe the right to a human decision, about certain things that are very important to us, because so many decisions about our lives and affecting our rights and freedoms are already being made by AI. And I said, there's a chapter in my book about this, but there's also a lovely book by the lawyer Susie Allegri called Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, which I will recommend as well. That's just come out. But I suggest in the book that all of our existing rights and freedoms are being violated by these creations that are hidden in a black box, which is owned by a corporation, even though the information that fueled it and taught it was ours in the first place. So yeah, we do need to take back control of that. No question.
Well, we really could go on for another hour, given the fantastic questions we've had, but really my schedule before me tells me it's time for networking, drinks, and canapes. But before that, I must say it's been a real privilege to have had Shami Chakrabarti here, and immense thanks to the Policy Institute for bringing Shami here to King's.
Thank you.
And really, quite frankly, only someone with 30 years' experience as an activist could have spoken with such openness, such frankness, and such clarity on an issue of such great importance. So thank you very much, Shami.